Hi Booktube, it's Roz, and here with a tag for Tag Tuesday. Now, every time I come on and do a tag, I talk about the fact that I'm a bit behind with my tags, and this one is a perfect illustration because it's at least 2, possibly 3 months, I think, since I was tagged by Jason of Old Blues Chapter and Verse to do the 10 years, 10 books tag, which was originated by Rick McDonnell, and I need to get on and do this one because it's a kind of like... It's very much a tag for 2020, asking us to look back at the decade of our reading from 2010 up to 2019. And you know, I think I've realised why I haven't done this one till now, and that's because it involves too many choices, and I can't do choices. It wants you to think of your kind of most important or meaningful or best book for each year for 10 years. Impossible. But today I'm feeling brave and resolute, so I'm going to attempt this. I decided the only way that I could do it was to put some parameters around it to make it less, to reduce the number of choices, if that makes sense. So I've done 2 things. One is a contraction, so that's, I've said that I will only pick novels. No short stories, no non-fiction, only novels. Secondly, no classics, so nothing from before 1950. And the other is kind of an expansion, a cheaty expansion, because I'm going to allow myself 1 book by a woman and 1 book by a man for each of my years reading in the decade. So let's go for it. And I need to do it briskly, or this will be tremendously long, because of course I'm talking about 20 books. So... first year, 2010, the 2 books I've chosen, well, the first book I've chosen is Housekeeping by Marilynne Robinson. Now, that was published in 1980, but I read it in 2010 because I just got into Marilynne Robinson from reading Gilead and Home, and I'm currently really looking forward to reading Jack, which will be the 4th book in that kind of... quartet of interconnected books. But I went back and read Housekeeping, and she'd had like a really long gap between writing that and writing Gilead, like 24 years gap between publication. But Housekeeping is a stunner of a book, and in some ways my favourite of hers. So I will say no more, but read it. The second book I've chosen is The Troubles by J.G. Farrell, and that's a book that was written in 1970. And I think one of the things that I was thinking about in 2010 that made me read the Marilynne Robinson from 1980 and the J.G. Farrell from 1970 is kind of realising that I read a lot of classics and a lot of current fiction, but that there was a whole kind of chunk of stuff, things that I'd missed, I suppose, in the course of my reading life, that were actually jolly good books that I should go back and re-find or rediscover. And The Troubles is part of what's known as Farrell's Empire trilogy. So he's a English-Irish author, and he wrote 3 books that are all kind of about the legacy of British colonialism, I guess. But The Troubles is the one set in Ireland, and it's, I think, an underrated book that's been forgotten a bit, so perhaps that's why I picked it. It's set in a hotel, a decaying hotel, and which is kind of almost like a metaphor for the decay of sort of Anglo-Irish society and the change that was coming in Ireland. Want to recommend. So on to 2011. Okay, now the first book, the book by a woman that I'm picking for 2011 is A Woman at Point Zero by Nawal Saadawi, and she wrote that in 1975, but it was only translated into English much more recently than that, I think. And in 2011 I got to visit Egypt and realised, I think, that I'd read the odd book by Egyptian authors, or authors perhaps of Egyptians of origin, but people like Ardaf Soueif, who's written some lovely books, but they're almost like geared to a non-Egyptian audience, if that makes sense. Whereas, the Yakubian Building would be another one by Al Aswani. Lovely book. But, goodness me, Al-Saadawi is writing really bold, strong, feminist novels for an Egyptian audience that then also have been translated. And I think that around 2011 was when I started to get really stuck into my project to read books from the non-Anglophone world, as it were, or books from away from sort of the UK and America and, yeah, the mainstream of what previously been my reading. So she kind of symbolises that, I suppose. It's an odd book, but I like an odd book. My second choice for 2011 is a book that was published, I think, was it 2007? It was a much newer book, and that's Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald. And when I saw that in my sort of list of things I read in 2011, I thought I have to pick this book because he's an author that almost like epitomises the kind of books that I've discovered and come to really enjoy in this decade, that we're talking about, which are sort of unconventional novels that are perhaps are they novel or are they travel writing or are they, what are they? I don't know. And they're very discursive and, go off in lots of different directions. And Austerlitz, superb. German author, but's lived a lot of his life in the UK, but he did write it originally in German. 2012, what should we pick for 2012? Well, I could tell that I was getting into my read things from different places project by then, because I noticed that one of the books I read that year, there were several books I read from sort of different places. One of them was a book from Senegal, So Long a Letter by Mariama, and she wrote that was published in 1979, and in French, and translated into English a bit more recently. And I suppose it, again, a bit like the Al-Saadawi, it's I suppose quite an explicitly feminist novel. It's looking at the place of women in sort of West African, Senegalese and society, but it's a subtle book, not just an angry book. And it's it kind of epitomises the sort of thing that I was perhaps reading in 2012. The other choice for 2012 is my male choice is Life and Fate by Vassily Grossman, and that is one of those books that when I saw it, I thought I just have to pick this, because it's a book that is, I think, they're in my kind of lifetime top 20. It's a book with a really interesting history, because he wrote it in the late 50s, submitted it for publication in 1960 in the USSR. He's a Russian author, and was told not only could it not be published, but they actually raided his flat, as KGB, took all his manuscripts, all his notes, even the ribbon from his typewriter, to try and prevent him from this book from being published. Fortunately, he'd already smuggled a manuscript, 2 copies, I think, out into to the West, as it were, and it was ultimately published it was published in English before it was published in Russian, if that makes sense, 1980. People sometimes compare it to War and Peace, Tolstoy. It's different in that Grossman was actually, it's a book about Stalingrad, I should say. It's a book about Stalingrad and the battle of Stalingrad. And so it is a book about war, but he was there. So whereas War and Peace is almost like historical fiction, it's Tolstoy's looking back to the sort of Napoleonic invasion of Russia, whereas this is much more immediate. It's a very human book, you know, ultimately about what it is to be good and why kindness matters, even in, conditions of brutality and awfulness. Again, a very, very high recommendation, that one. 2013, I picked a book that I thought had been written by a woman, and then when I looked it up, I realised it was written by a man. But I've left it in because that intrigued me as to why did I think this book was written by a woman. And that's The Garden of Evening Mists by Twang, and that came out in 2012. And he's a Malaysian author, and this is, I think, perhaps was his first book written in English. I thought that it was written by a woman because, and this is my prejudice, isn't it? It's such a very sensitive book about nuances of emotion. It's also a very, very beautiful book. It's about gardening, and it's also about World War II and how Japanese behaved in Malaysia, and about is there any way to recover from that or find sort of resolution and I don't know, redemption. Yeah. Anyway, strongly recommend it. So this is the odd year when I picked two books by men, unintentionally. And as I say, it was only when I looked it up that I discovered I was wrong. But the other book I'm going to pick is So Long, See You Tomorrow by William Maxwell, which I think was published in 1979, but I didn't read it till 2013. And that is the first book in this list by a kind of white American bloke, if you know what I mean. And it's symbolic, I guess, that it's in there in 2013, because I think I'd had a kind of like a period of about a decade when I almost kind of like boycotted reading anything that was sort of could remotely be described as the, you know, great American novel, or anything by kind of an American male author. Yeah, that, I just had sort of hit, enough of reading those blokes. And then this was a book that kind of restored my kind of confidence or something in that actually there are American men writing sort of sensitive and interesting books, I suppose. It's also I suppose again a book that epitomises a type of book that I've probably read more of in the last decade than before, and that's kind of autobiographical fiction where you're not quite sure how much is taken from the author's sort of own life. It's set in his hometown, about the aftermath of a death. I won't say more than that. It's very kind of calm. No, not calm's the wrong word. Kind of judiciously written, kind of like succinct and elegant and thoughtful. There we go. 2014, my female pick is, and it definitely is by a woman, is Please Look After Mother, or I think in America it was published as Please Look After Mom, by Kyung-sook Shin, and she's a Korean author, and I picked this as a memorable book from that year. It was published in 2012. 2008 in Korea, and then translated a couple of years later, and it came sort of to my attention. I don't know why that year, but it's one of those books that manages to be a bestseller, but also a really kind of interesting literary book, I suppose. It's a bit of a funny way to describe things, isn't it? But it's all written in the third person, which is hard to pull off successfully, and I felt she did it. And I suppose it's the kind of book that I look for in my reading around the world, because it's a book that tells you a lot about Korean society and the place of women and older women in that, whilst also being a really satisfying novel. Yeah. My other choice for that year is Harvest by Jim Crace, and that actually came out in 2013, so that was kind of quite a new book. And I've read a few books by Jim Crace. He's quite an experimental writer, and this book is kind of historical fiction. It's set in an English medieval village, but we don't know if it's exactly medieval. It's slightly timeless. What I mean is it could be quite a span, across quite a span of several hundred years. It's not kind of located firmly in a particular sort of year or reign of a king or whatever. It's very intense, but it's also kind of like an allegory for contemporary British society. So yeah, because his books are never, like, it works as historical fiction, but it also works on another level, if that makes sense. His books are never simple. So 2015, my choice by a woman is In the Shadow of the Banyan by Vaddey Ratner, which was written in 2012, and she wrote it in English, although she's a Cambodian by origin, but moved to the United States or Canada? United States, I think, fleeing the Khmer Rouge. But this book, again, it's that autobiographical fiction thing that I was mentioning, where she takes her experiences as a child living through the nightmare, almost hard to imagine period when the Khmer Rouge sort of took Cambodia back to year zero. But she uses fiction to enable her to write about that beautifully, as well as exploring the full kind of horror of the times. Yeah, great book. The other book that I picked for 2015, the one by the bloke, is The Railway by Hamid Ismailov. Now, he wrote that sometime in the early sort of 1990s, but it wasn't published then, because he's an Uzbek writer, and he was born in Kyrgyzstan, but he's Uzbek by, they're nomadic people, so they were moving around, so they're a bit arbitrary where the lines were drawn. He's definitely Uzbek, and living in Uzbekistan, he at that point he was unable to publish the book. He was becoming seen as sort of a distant writer, as it were, and he actually fled Uzbekistan and came to the UK ultimately, kind of in the mid-90s. And so, but this book was published, so it was published in the UK in 2006. Why do I love this book? Because it does that thing that I appreciate of kind of enlightening me about a place and its history, but in a literally satisfying way. So it's set in this kind of imaginary small town in Uzbekistan where there's a railway, and it was always on the Silk Route, this town, and now it's on the railway route. So it's like a kind of a junction point where people from different places come together, and it has a very sort of diverse population. And the story goes roughly from sort of 1900 up to about sometime in the 1980s, I guess. And it's sort of episodic, and it's eccentric, and it kind of has like kind of little cameos of different characters that kind of tell I suppose the 20th century story of Uzbekistan from Ismailov's perspective. Yeah, kind of book I appreciate for sure. Now, 2016, pick number one, is Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeleine Thien, which was written in 2016 in English because she's she's Canadian, but her of sort of Malaysian, Chinese sort of family background. And this is a book that, again, it's a bit of a theme, I think, in the things that I end up picking as my favourite books of the year. And because one of those themes is books that kind of encompass a whole chunk of history, but through fiction. And Do Not Say We Have Nothing is a book about 20th century China and the Cultural Revolution. And it's sort of, well, actually Civil War through to Tiananmen Square, kind of in the scope of the book. But it's a book about music and culture and retaining yourself despite a regime or living in a historical time that suppresses some of what you value. It's a meaty book that's also kind of like a bit of a family saga, but it's also a book about the importance of recording things, keeping the notes, the family, the record. It has this sort of almost mythic kind of place in this book. I loved it. Real goodie. You know, you could say it's a bit baggy, but no, it did it for me. My other book for 2016 was published in 2015. So again, it's kind of we're getting more bit more contemporary now. Like I think by this point I'm reading more books that are as they come out, if that makes sense. But this one is The Sympathizer by Viet, Thanh, and Nguyen, and that's a book. He's Vietnamese, but lives in America, and it's a book about the Vietnam War and before and after, and from a very different perspective. It's a book of ideas. It's also a spy book. It's a war book. I think you could legitimately criticise it for being a bit kind of sprawling and baggy, but it did it for me in giving me a richness of content, ideas, different understanding of a different sort of perspective on a time and a place. But it's also a book about being an immigrant in the States, which is a bit of a theme also in a lot of things that I've read over the last sort of 5 years. So it makes sense. It makes sense why it's in this list. Whereas 2017, I've picked two books that were both published in 2017 and are from the kind of UK American literary market that I might have said I was sort of moved away from, but actually I still read things from that. And one is Winter by Ali Smith, and it may not have been the best book by a woman that I read that year, 2017, but I had to pick it because I found her Seasons Quartet, and Winter was the second. So she did Autumn, Winter that came out in 2017, and we've had Spring, and then Summer is just out, and now in 2020, and I'm so looking forward to reading it. And I think I really admire Ali Smith's project in writing these books, because what she's doing is she's writing books bang up to date, you know, like trying to really write about what is happening right now as she writes the books, and that's brave. And I've always been a fan of Ali Smith. She's a Scottish writer. I'm also, like, she's stylistically creative as well, and I liked Winter because it was a book about art, and it had a couple of Barbara Hepworth, who's one of my all-time favourite sculptors, is kind of key to the book. So yeah, ideas. I love ideas. It's a book full of ideas. Yeah. As was my other choice for 2017, was Lincoln in the Bardo by George Sanders. Now that was a big book in 2017, and people had differing opinions about it, and some people found it a bit intolerable. I was besotted with that book. It's all the different voices, and it's sort of, as I say, I like an odd book. Let's face it, we know this now. We realise this, haven't we? And it is odd, and yet I found it very accessible. On to 2018, and again, one of my choices was a very big book that year, and that's Milkman by Anna Burns. Did it win the Booker? I think it probably did, and perhaps Lincoln in the Bardo did as well. It's really kind of, in a way, it's surprising for me, given the way my reading range is around, that I then end up picking a book that was sort of one of the star books of the year as my favourite book. But Milkman is a book that it's one of the most memorable books that I've read in the last few years. I think, Anna Burns, who wrote it, Irish writer, obviously, she's so bold in how she constructed that book, and the voice. Once you've got the voice of the main character, you're carried into the world of that book, and that was a world the world of the Troubles in Ireland that I was aware of as an English person and a child and young person, that was sort of very much other, and that we were fed a version of, I suppose, through news and so on, and I think she's done a wonderful thing in embedding that book right in there, and sort of opening the doors on that for us. Yeah, thank you Anna Burns, great book. My other choice for that year, funnily enough, is another Irish book, and it's by a man, obviously, and that's From a Low and Quiet Sea by Donal Ryan, and I think, and Ali Smith does this as well, one of the interesting things going on in sort of writing, it's certainly in the sort of British Isles, shall we say, the UK and Ireland, is how we are how authors are bringing kind of issues around sort of migration, migrants, refugees into their novels, rather than sort of leaving that out, making it more central. And this is a book that does that in a very beautiful way. Again, it's a Ros book in that it's kind of structurally interesting. It has sort of three protagonists, and we follow their stories, and then eventually they interconnect. It is beautiful words all the way through. Yeah, magic. It came out in 2018, so both those books were my 2018 choices, were 2018 books, if that makes sense, because I've been reading more stuff, when it was fresh, I suppose. But 2019, I've picked two books that were not contemporary, because I've kind of reverted to picking books that relate to my reading of things from sort of non-UK, non-American authors. And my woman author choice is The Pot-Bellied Virgin by Alicia Yanez Cosio, and that's a book from Ecuador, and she wrote it in 1985, or it was published in 1985 in Ecuador, only translated in 2006 though, into English. I've talked about this book on BookTube before, I know, it 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 it's a book that is funny and odd. Well, you know, I like an odd book, and it's a book about women. It's a book about Ecuadorian small town life. It's a book about how the church sort of that it's the church's role, I guess, in that society. Yes, it's kind of just a big win for me. As was the other book that I'm picking, Senselessness by Horacio Castellanos Moya. Now, he's a Salvadorian writer from El Salvador, but had to leave, I think, El Salvador. He may be back there now. He wrote it in this book in 2004. It was translated in 2008. And it's set probably in Guatemala. You know, he never says, he never names the country, but it's very definitely a Central American book. And it might, in some ways, it's an odd book for me to choose. Not odd in that sense, odd in the other sense, because it's a book about a sex-obsessed man who's a bit of a drunk, and there's a lot of sex in this book, but what he's doing, this man, and it's this sort of the protagonist, is he needs money, and he's taken a job compiling the eyewitness testimony of indigenous Guatemalans, we'll say they're Guatemalans, I'm sure it's Guatemala, who about massacres that occurred in the in some rural parts of the country, and the church is kind of creating a record of this, and people have been out and interviewed, and then he's kind of compiling that, and he goes from sort of doing this as I'm just going to do this for the money, and I can do this, I'm a writer, I can do this, you know, I can edit this, to being drawn in, but not drawn in so much by the facts that these first person accounts are giving, but the inadvertent poetry of the language, and he becomes, I won't say more about it. I would just say it's an absolutely fascinating book, and it brings together some of those things that I really like in a book, doesn't it? Which is that it's odd, that it tells me something about a place and a period of history and politics and culture that I might not otherwise know, and is kind of stylistically interesting in a kind of literary sense. Yeah, so that's my 10 years, 10 books. I'm not going to tag anyone because it's so long since this tag was doing the rounds, and also because it's an awful lot of work trying to think about your last 10 years of reading, so I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But if, having heard mine, you're inspired to do this tag, that would be lovely. And if you've read any of these books, I would love to hear your comments. Thanks.